You open Instagram. A meme makes you laugh. A thirst trap holds your gaze. A friend's vacation photo sparks a flicker of envy. A breaking news post makes your chest tighten. 5 minutes in, and you've felt more emotions than you have all day. But who's actually feeling them? Who's in charge of those reactions? You or something deeper? Sigmund Freud believed that the human mind is driven by a constant tug-of-war between our deepest desires, our moral compass, and the part of us that tries to keep it all together. He called these forces the id, the superego, and the ego. Over a century later, these inner battles are no longer just internal. They're playing out on screen 24/7. Social media has become the stage where our impulses, ideals, and identities clash in real time. And maybe, just maybe, your feed is more than entertainment. Maybe it's a mirror, reflecting the subconscious forces Freud tried to map long ago. To understand how social media interacts with our minds, we need to travel back in time, over 100 years, to the world of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. Freud wasn't scrolling through reels or checking notifications, but he was deeply interested in something just as addictive: the human psyche, and what drives our thoughts, behaviors, and desires. Freud believed that our minds aren't unified, but divided into three powerful and conflicting parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. Each one plays a role in shaping who we are. And when you understand them, you start to see their fingerprints everywhere, including on every social media platform you use. Let's break them down. The id. This is your most primal self. Think of the id as your inner child or your inner caveman. It doesn't care about consequences, responsibilities, or social norms. It just wants what feels good, right now. The id is driven by what Freud called the pleasure principle. It seeks immediate gratification: food, sex, comfort, attention. It doesn't wait. It doesn't think. It wants. In modern terms, the id is the part of you that craves likes, doom scrolls until 2 a.m., or impulsively DMs your ex. It's pure, raw desire, the superego. On the opposite side is the superego. If the id is your inner child, the superego is your inner parent, or more accurately, every parent, teacher, and authority figure you've ever internalized. It represents societal norms, morals, and ideals. The superego is the voice in your head that says, "That's inappropriate," or "You should be better than this." It's not always kind. Sometimes it shames. Sometimes it pressures. But its intention is to guide you toward what's right, even if it means denying what you want. Online, the superego is the reason you hesitate before posting something controversial. It's what makes you self-censor, feel guilt, or strive for a curated, perfect image that aligns with social standards. The ego caught in the middle is the ego, the mediator. The ego's job is to navigate reality. It tries to keep both the id and the superego happy while making practical, socially acceptable decisions. Freud called this the reality principle. The ego is the part of you that thinks things through. It rationalizes. It negotiates. It creates compromises. Maybe you want to rage pause post after a breakup, ID, but you also want to seem mature and respectable. Superego. The ego finds a middle ground. It drafts a cryptic story with just the right amount of mystery and restraint. A constant balancing act. According to Freud, we're in constant psychological negotiation, balancing what we crave, what we believe is right, and what the world demands of us. This inner tension exists in everyone, and it's exhausting, subtle, and deeply human. Now, fast forward to the present day. Put this ancient internal struggle into the hyper-connected, always-on world of social media. What happens? You get a digital environment that doesn't just reflect those inner forces, but amplifies them. Platforms are designed to poke at your id, challenge your ego, and distort your superego. They don't just observe your psyche, they interact with it, push it, and profit from it. We all carry the id within us, that impulsive, pleasure-hungry part of our psyche Freud described. In everyday life, it's somewhat kept in check by reality. We can't just scream in public when we're angry or grab everything we want without consequence. But online, the rules are different. Social media platforms have created a digital playground where the id is not just free to roam. It's actively encouraged to take the lead. These platforms are designed to speak directly to that primal part of you that wants immediate pleasure, validation, attention, and escape. They're built not for reflection or restraint, but for reaction. Let's break down how. Dopamine and desire. The science of craving. Every like, comment, or notification triggers a little hit of dopamine, the same brain chemical associated with food, sex, and gambling. It's the brain's reward system lighting up, and just like any pleasure-based mechanism, it can become addictive. The id is all about chasing that dopamine high. And social media, it's a dopamine machine. It rewards impulsivity. You're encouraged to post without overthinking, scroll endlessly without stopping, and consume content that gives you an instant emotional rush. Whether it's a thirst trap, a funny meme, or a shocking video. The more stimulating the content, the more the id wants it. And the platforms know it. Addictive by design. Social media isn't just randomly addictive. It's intentionally designed to keep you hooked. Algorithms track what you like, how long you linger, what makes you stop scrolling. They tailor content to feed your unique cravings, ensuring the id gets what it wants before you even consciously realize it. That just one more scroll feeling? That's not weakness. That's engineering. Think about endless scrolling, no natural stopping point, autoplay features, videos that keep coming, even if you were planning to stop. Notifications, constant digital nudges, reminding you of the possibility of pleasure or connection. Likes and reactions, simple metrics that reduce complex emotional experiences into easy-to-consume validations. It's like Freud's id got a smartphone, and the best UX designers on Earth are catering to it 24/7. Targeted advertising and the pleasure principle. Freud's pleasure principle, the idea that we instinctively avoid pain and pursue pleasure, is exactly what advertisers use to sell products on social media. Targeted ads don't just offer you things. They predict your desires, sometimes before you're even aware of them. Have you ever been thinking about something? Shoes, a vacation, a specific craving, and then seen an ad for it on Instagram or TikTok? That eerie precision taps directly into your id. The ad isn't offering logic, it's offering indulgence. And the platform profits from how much your id wants to say yes. The consequences of an unchecked id. But the id doesn't plan for the future. It doesn't consider long-term consequences. It just wants to feel good now. When the id runs wild online, our digital behavior becomes reactionary, compulsive, and often disconnected from real life. We see this in several ways. FOMO and overconsumption. When your id sees everyone else on lavish trips, getting married, or launching their dream businesses, it wants that too. It doesn't filter that this is curated content. It just feels the fear of missing out. You start to chase more, buy more, compare more. and none of it truly satisfies. Envy and self-worth. The id also responds emotionally, intensely to perceived lack. You see someone getting more likes, more followers, more attention, and your self-worth takes a hit. The id doesn't understand that social media is a highlight reel. It just sees someone else winning and feels like it's losing. Impulse and outrage. Think about how quickly online outrage spreads. Someone posts a controversial opinion. Before the ego has time to process, the id wants to react, to shame, cancel, clap back. Social media's structure rewards the fastest, loudest voices, not the most thoughtful ones. A false reality, built for the id. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect is that social media creates an environment where ID-driven behavior becomes normalized. Overindulgence, comparison, validation seeking, it's all baked into the culture. The more we give in, the more distorted our sense of reality becomes. We forget that what we're chasing, likes, followers, virality, isn't actually real connection or fulfillment. It's a simulation of gratification, designed to satisfy the id, but rarely nourish the soul. So what happens when the id is constantly being fed, but not balanced? Who steps in to keep things from spiraling out of control? That's where the ego comes in. After the id chases its pleasures, and the superego whispers its judgments, it falls to the ego to make peace between the two. It's the rational self, the one grounded in reality. It knows that you can't always say what you're thinking, post what you're feeling, or indulge every urge. It knows that other people are watching. In Freud's model, the ego is a mediator. But in the modern age of social media, it's not just mediating, it's curating, performing, negotiating who we are for the world to see. It's become the project manager of our digital lives, building the persona. On social media, the ego takes on the task of crafting a version of ourselves that feels safe, acceptable, and appealing. We present a filtered version of reality, not necessarily dishonest, but selective. The ego understands what content will get likes, what will be praised, what aligns with social norms, and what risks backlash. This isn't just vanity, it's survival. In a space where your digital presence is judged, compared, and even monetized, the ego becomes the editor-in-chief of your online identity. Think about the photos we don't post, the captions we write and rewrite, the way we word a tweet to sound clever, not angry, the decision to hide a like count or to archive an old post that doesn't fit the grid anymore. These aren't random choices. They're calculated acts of self-preservation and image control. The ego is constantly balancing between expressing who we are and managing how we're perceived. The weight of constant performance. But this curation comes at a cost. The pressure to maintain an idealized digital self can lead to emotional exhaustion. The ego is already tasked with holding the psyche together in the real world. Now it's stretched even thinner in the digital one. It's not just navigating your life, it's managing a brand. This contributes to rising levels of anxiety, imposter syndrome, and identity fatigue, especially among younger users. When your self-worth becomes tethered to engagement metrics, you begin to question, am I being me, or am I being what the algorithm wants me to be? The ego begins to lose its grounding, and that's dangerous, because the ego is supposed to be the stable center. If it gets swept up in illusion, the whole balance of the psyche can start to wobble. Conformity, and the digital crowd. Another challenge the ego faces online is social pressure. Freud believed the ego is shaped by interactions with the external world. On social media, the external world is millions of users, and their voices are loud. The ego wants to fit in. It adapts. It studies trends. It follows influencers. It sees what's being applauded and what's being attacked. And often, it conforms, not because it believes in something, but because it fears being rejected. This is where digital identity becomes fragile. When we start modeling ourselves too heavily on others' expectations, we risk losing a sense of who we really are. The ego becomes more reactive than reflective, seeking belonging, facing comparison. The ego also seeks connection and belonging, one of its most human qualities. Social media communities can fulfill that desire beautifully. You find your niche. You discover people who think like you, feel like you, love like you. But with that connection comes comparison. The ego is always comparing to peers, influencers, strangers. And even when the comparisons are unfair or unrealistic, they still hurt. Seeing someone else's highlight reel when you're stuck and you're behind the scenes can fracture your self-esteem. Even positive engagement, likes, compliments, shares, can backfire. If your sense of self becomes dependent on that feedback, your ego becomes externalized. It starts looking outward for validation instead of inward for identity. Digital boundaries and the healthy ego. Despite these challenges, the ego is still your best defense against chaos. It's the part of you that can pause before reacting, that can recognize when something online is triggering your insecurities or pulling at your worst impulses. A strong ego sets boundaries. It understands that your worth isn't defined by your follower count. It knows when to unplug, when to say no to oversharing, when to remember that a curated feed isn't the whole story. In many ways, the modern ego is learning new skills. It's not just navigating reality anymore. It's navigating virtual reality. And it has to evolve quickly because the online world is constantly shifting, constantly testing, constantly demanding attention. But if the ego is trying to hold the line between impulse and ideal, who's whispering in its ear, reminding it what's right, what's acceptable, and what's not? That voice belongs to the superego. Freud described the superego as the moral compass of the psyche, the part of us that internalizes societal rules, cultural norms, and parental expectations. It tells us what's good, what's bad, and most of all, what's acceptable. But in today's hyper-connected world, the superego isn't just shaped by family or culture. It's being reprogrammed by the algorithm. Social media has become a powerful source of moral influence. It tells us what to care about, who to admire, what to be a and what values to uphold. But unlike traditional morality, which is often slow to change and rooted in long-standing institutions, online morality is fast, reactive, and public. And the superego is listening, internalized judgment in an external world. In Freud's theory, the superego is largely invisible. It operates internally, an ever-present voice of judgment and restraint. But on social media, that judgment is no longer private. It's been externalized, placed in the hands of the crowd. Post the wrong opinion, share the wrong meme, follow the wrong person, and you may face an avalanche of criticism, shame, or even public cancellation. The superego, once an internal sense of conscience, now feels like a million eyes watching, waiting to pounce. This leads to a new kind of behavior, preemptive self-censorship. You don't just wonder, is this right? You ask, will this offend someone? Or will this get me canceled? The superego is no longer just the voice of your parents. It's the voice of the internet collective, whispering or shouting in your ear. Cancel culture and digital punishment. Cancel culture can be seen as the superego in overdrive, a collective moral force exerting pressure to conform, punish, and correct. It reflects our desire to hold people accountable, but sometimes it becomes more about retribution than growth. Freud warned that when the superego becomes too dominant, it leads to guilt, anxiety, and repression. We see this today in the way people online walk on eggshells, over-apologize, or stay silent out of fear of backlash. There's a difference between ethics and performance morality, and the superego in the age of social media often can't tell the difference. It praises what appears good, even when the intention or impact is questionable. Virtue signaling, moral posturing, and digital dogpiling aren't always rooted in true values. They're often driven by the superego's desperate need to align with what's socially acceptable at that moment. And since that moment is constantly shifting, the pressure never lets up. Shame as a weapon. Shame is the superego's favorite tool. It makes us feel unworthy when we've done something wrong, whether real or perceived. In small doses, shame can help us learn and grow. But online, shame is amplified and often public. Think of the viral call-out posts, the receipts, the quote tweets meant to humiliate. Social media turns shame into a spectacle, and the superego learns from that. It starts policing you hard. It internalizes not just your values, but everyone else's opinions of you, and that's a heavy burden. Echo chambers and moral absolutism. The superego wants structure. It wants to know what's right and what's wrong. But on social media, we often end up in echo chambers that reinforce a specific worldview. Within those digital bubbles, morality can become black and white, with no room for complexity, nuance, or evolution. If you disagree, you're not just wrong. You're problematic. Or worse, you're an enemy. This creates a dangerous loop. The superego becomes rigid, unable to tolerate moral ambiguity. It stops reflecting and starts reacting, mirroring the very behavior Freud associated with neurosis, obsessive guilt, harsh self-judgment, and repression. And for some, it leads to burnout. People retreat, go quiet, or disengage completely, not because they've stopped caring, but because the emotional cost of moral performance has become too high. Reclaiming the superego. But the superego isn't inherently bad. At its best, it pushes us to be better humans. It encourages compassion, empathy, responsibility. And social media has the potential to amplify those virtues too. We've seen incredible movements born online, acts of collective conscience that demand justice, equality, and truth. When the superego is aligned with genuine values rather than fear or vanity, it can help foster meaningful change. The key is to reclaim your superego from the chaos of the crowd, to listen to your own moral compass, not just the trending one, to slow down, to ask, am I posting this because I believe it? Am I sharing this to perform or to connect? Am I judging others for growth or for the thrill of outrage? When we bring intentionality back into our digital morality, we shift the superego from a reactive critic to a conscious guide. By now, it's clear. Freud's century-old map of the mind, id, ego, and superego, isn't just relevant in the digital age. It might be one of the most accurate lenses through which to understand our behavior online. Because social media doesn't just show us who we are, it activates us. It pokes at our impulses, challenges our self-image, and tests our moral codes, all at once, all the time. And we're left trying to navigate it all, usually without realizing the psychological machinery behind the scenes. The id craves attention, pleasure, and validation. Social media feeds it like candy, instant likes, endless scrolls, bite-sized dopamine. The ego tries to manage reality, building personas, setting digital boundaries, and adapting to the complex social world online. The superego looms with judgment and expectation, absorbing the values of the digital crowd and often enforcing them with intensity, sometimes fairness, sometimes fear. This constant push and pull creates emotional fatigue. We scroll for comfort and end up comparing. We post to connect and end up performing. We express ourselves and end up censoring. It's not just a technological problem. It's a psychological overload. But here's the good news. Once you see the forces at play, you can begin to regain control. You don't have to delete all your apps or go off the grid. Freud wouldn't tell you to suppress these forces. He'd tell you to understand them, to become conscious of what was once unconscious. So what does that look like in practice? 1. Develop digital self-awareness. The first step is noticing. When you feel the urge to post something, pause and ask, what part of me is driving this? Am I seeking connection or validation? Am I reacting from impulse or responding with intention? These are questions your ego can ask, not to restrict you, but to help you choose instead of just react. 2. Strengthen the ego with boundaries. Set limits that support your mental health. That might mean unfollowing accounts that trigger comparison, turning off push notifications, or taking breaks from apps that feel emotionally draining. Not out of fear, but from a place of self-regulation. Let the ego do what it does best, keep you grounded in reality. 3. Question the superego's standards. Not every trending outrage deserves your energy. Not every online norm reflects your real values. Give yourself permission to step back from performative morality and ask, do I actually believe in this? Am I acting from guilt, fear, or purpose? You are allowed to grow, to make mistakes, and to think critically. The healthiest superego is not a tyrant, it's a teacher. 4. Let the id speak, but don't let it drive. Pleasure isn't the enemy. You're allowed to enjoy the funny videos, the memes, the moments of attention. But make sure the id doesn't dominate. Let it have a voice, not the steering wheel. Ultimately, social media is a tool, one that can mirror and magnify our inner world. Freud's framework reminds us that we are not singular, simple beings. We are layered, conflicted, dynamic. And if we can bring more consciousness to our scrolling, our sharing, and our self-expression, we can begin to reclaim our digital experience, not as an escape, but as an extension of self, balanced, aware, and deeply human. So where does this all leave us? In a world where likes can lift us and comment sections can crush us, it's tempting to blame social media for everything. But the truth is more nuanced. These platforms didn't create our desires, insecurities, or ideals. They just gave them a louder stage. Freud's model reminds us that our inner world is always in motion. The id wants pleasure. The superego demands perfection. And the ego? It's stuck in the middle, trying to make sense of it all. Social media didn't invent this struggle, but it intensifies it. It amplifies the id, pressures the ego, and weaponizes the superego. It takes our private inner conflicts and plays them out in public for everyone to see. But once we recognize the script, we don't have to keep playing the role unconsciously. You can scroll more mindfully, share more intentionally, set boundaries that protect your peace, reflect instead of react. Choose presence over performance, because at the end of the day, your feed isn't just a collection of posts, it's a reflection of your mind in motion. And the more you understand those deeper drives, the better equipped you are to navigate this digital world, not as a victim of it, but as a conscious participant in your own psychological store.